So today we've got one of the single biggest updates to Warhammer 40K in really quite a long time. Space Marine power armor just got a whole ton better. There's some heavy nerfs to Harlequins, Tower and Custodes and Indirect Fire. They've finally fixed the Bodyguard rule and much more besides. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we've got the long-awaited balanced Dataslate, hopefully going to shake up 40k a bit and make the game a bit more interesting. Over the last few months, game balance really hasn't been at a very good place. Chapter approved reigned in a fair few of the armies that have been dominating for a long time, only to have them straight up replaced by things like Tau, Custodians and Harlequins, books that were so powerful that they just feel like they're playing on an entire extra level compared with everyone else. It looks like this Dataslate should really help this. It reins in a bunch of their excesses, really helps certain armies including Space Marines and Guard, and has a few fairly big changes to 40k in general, to things like Indirect Fire and Bodyguard rules. So here's a rough contents of what's on the balanced Dataslate then. There's 4 sections that are more general that apply to quite a lot of models within the game. The flyer restrictions from last time, where you can only take 2 at a Strike Force game, that's not changed. There's then a fairly big nerf to Indirect Fire for just about all factions besides Imperial Guard. This new Armour of Contempt rule is the Space Marine durability buff. That applies to basically most of the units from Space Marines, Chaos Marines, Death Guard, Thousand Suns, Grey Knights and Sisters. And there's a nerf to the Bodyguard rules, often been a problem within 40k. They've also been heavily toned down. Then for specific faction changes, there's really quite a lot of stuff. Adeptus Auroritas see the armor buff and more miracle dice. The Imperial Guard get really quite a nice damage boost special rule across much of their army, plus their standard infantry squads now randomly all get free gear. Adeptus Custodes don't see any points changes, but they lose some objectives secured and a lot of stratagems are limited. Space Marines have just had their chapter tat altered a bit to fit in with this new powerful Armour of Contempt rule. Death Guard gain objectives secured on their Terminators in a bit of a mirror of the Thousand Suns. Harlequins have had some hefty points increases on their Skimmers, and a couple of their characters have been toned down too. And for Tau, their Montcar tactical philosophy has been nerfed, as have Farsight Enclaves and another couple of little extra rules. They certainly don't enjoy the barrage changes though. Otherwise, there's reprints of all the previous changes from the balanced data slate, things like the Necron core changes and the Chaos Marines extra hits on 6s, and notably there's nothing at all for Tyranids, Knights or Demons. I guess the NID book is too recent, the Knights have their own codex coming out soon, and for some reason Games Workshop don't want to give Demons anything, just because they have 1 or 2 fairly powerful builds within their faction. An absolutely crazy amount to talk about, so let's go through it. We'll start with the game-wide rule changes first, and then go through each of the factions in turn. So first up for new rules we have the changes to Indirect Fire. I think the main issue with Indirect Fire in 40k at the moment was armies like Tau. They just had access to some very cheap and very effective barrage weapons, things like smart missiles and air-bursting fragmentation projectors, capable of just hoovering up enemy light infantry, and even stacking some fairly decent damage against heavies if you had enough concentrated fire. I was kind of expecting them to address those weapons in particular, as they seem like the problem ones, but they've just brought down the nerf hammer on barrage weapons in general, meaning they're going to be far less effective unless you're firing with line of sight. If they can see their target, then they get to fire normally, but if they can't draw a line of sight to them, then you get -1 ballistic skill, and the enemy unit gets +1 to their saving throws. This now applies to all barrage weapons in the game. The only units that are affected are Astra Militarum weapons. I guess they're kind of known for their indirect fire and artillery, and it's probably for the best to be honest. Guard aren't exactly the strongest right now, and outside the 4 payload Manticore, quite a lot of their other ignores line of sight options aren't even particularly strong anyway. For me, I feel that this is actually really quite a punishing change to most of the game. It most certainly does do the job of toning down Tau weapons. -1 to hit will really quite hurt them when they hit on 4s at base. Even if they get a marker light, that's still going to tone down their damage quite a lot, and the +1 to save is also going to be pretty brutal against their relatively low strength barrage weapons. What I'm not really such a fan of though is that it just basically ruins most of the other barrage weapons throughout the entirety of 40k. I feel like most of them were in at least a fairly good place, costed quite highly to represent the ignores line of sight effect, and often not dealing excessive amounts of damage. -1 ballistic skill would have been painful enough on its own, but the +1 to save really adds insult to injury. Things like Scorpius Disintegrators, Sicaran Arcuses for the Space Marines, Orc Squig Boggies, Eldar support weapons, they're all going to be far less tempting to take now. Personally, I can't help but think it might have been better just to increase the cost on the ignores line of sight Tau weapons, as opposed to just making a massive, almost game-wide change, which hits a whole load of units that weren't really particularly a problem. In any case, thanks to this, I'd expect to see a fair amount less ignores line of sight weapons in people's armies, maybe a bit more focus on units that can just move fast and get line of sight in the conventional way. Next up, and perhaps one of the most radical and surprising changes out of this update, is Armour of Contempt. I think we might have to explore this in an entire extra video, just to talk about some of the ramifications. This is basically really quite a strong durability buff to basically all the factions that wear power armour and also their tanks and vehicles. In specific, it applies to the Adeptus Astartes, the Sanctic Astartes, so the Grey Knights, Heretic Astartes, so Chaos Space Marines, Thousand Sons and Death Guard, and also the Adeptus Sororitas. The rule basically means that you worsen the armor penetration characteristic of the attack by 1 when enemy models make attacks against these units, which is going to be incredibly relevant as the standard units in these armies all have a 3+ save or better. The only models it doesn't apply to are anything that you already get a +1 to your save for, things like Storm Shields, Relic Shields or Combat Shields, Celestian Sacrosancts, as again they also have one of those shields, or any other special rules that worsen the armor penetration of an attack. The only other exception are Nemesis Dreadknights. To be honest, they're probably strong enough already, they certainly didn't need a +1 to their save on top of that 2+ armor. What's interesting is that it basically just applies to all the units within the faction. It doesn't even matter whether they're wearing power armor or not. It'll apply to Terminators, it'll apply to Servitors or Sisters Repentia for example, and still apply to all of the Space Marine, Grey Knight and Sisters motor pools. I think it's going to be particularly relevant on vehicles. High toughness and fairly high saves, often without invuls, are exactly the sort of things that are going to benefit most from this. My first thoughts on vehicles go to things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts or Plague Burst Crawlers. The units that are really strong already will certainly enjoy an extra damage debuff. Infantry wise, this now makes Storm Shields really quite a much worse pickup. The 4+ invul save is still really handy, but for a 3+ save model it now won't change anything at all against AP-1 or AP-2. So you're only really going to see the benefit against very high AP things with the invul save. The rule also works great on literally anything with a 2+ save already. A lot of characters will really like it, and things like Space Marine Terminators, Paragon Warsuits, and things like Centurions are going to absolutely love this. Overall, I think it's really quite a meaningful power boost to all of these factions. They're just going to be a fair bit tougher. Certainly not the worst thing in the world, as most of these guys were languishing around about mid-tier. Grey Knights were perhaps one of the strongest of this entire bunch, but not applying to Dread Knights also means they get a little bit less of a buff from it. Like I said, we'll probably have to explore this in an entire extra video. It's going to be interesting to look through the different units and see which might be more tempting with the change. Finally, for big 40k wide things, we've got the Bodyguard rule, one that's been causing kind of silly problems throughout the entirety of 9th edition, whether or not it's Space Marine Bodyguards standing behind Dreadnoughts to make them untargetable, or Celestian Sacrosancts gaming things with Celestine to string out 2 objectives, so you've got a character on an objective that you can't shoot in any way. I think there's a number of different ways that you could fix this, but Games Workshop has actually been fairly punitive of it, and now basically just say that the Bodyguards grant the Lookout Sir rule to characters within 3 inches, even if the Bodyguard squad numbers less than 3 models. That's a very heavy nerf from just not being able to target them with ranged attacks at all. It's going to mean that they no longer just give you complete immunity from things like sniper fire, which has certainly been struggling in 9th edition. If the character is the closest model, then he's still going to be able to shoot them, and you won't be able to do silly things like protected characters cancelling Overwatch because you can't even target them. Perhaps one of the more interesting exceptions is that Tyrannid Tyrant Guard now give Lookout Sir to Hive Tyrants just in the normal sense, so they're still going to be very relevant for protecting them, but again no longer quite as powerful as what we've seen they'll be in the Codex. Overall, I think it's still a handy enough ability to have. It does mean that you're still protected until the very last model dies in the squad, but I feel like we'll see a big drop off in the use of these guys. They're just no longer quite as mandatory. I would have guessed they might have gone for something like the Bodyguard squad may intercept the hits for a character, but I guess at least this one's a fairly straightforward one. It does key off existing rules already. Next up, let's move into the specific factions then, and for Adeptus Sororitas, as we already said, their armor buff is going to be great, tougher infantry and vehicles. They're just going to be a bit harder to shift across the faction. They did receive a few fairly hefty nerfs in Chapter Approved, and it seems that while Games Workshop has taken things down a bit, they have also given them a bit back in this, as they're going to have quite a lot more miracle dice to play with, as they're going to get 1 each turn, not just 1 each battle round, so basically double the free dice throughout a game. That means that you're going to have plenty to play with, you're likely to get a fair few more high results on the rolls, and it might just further alter the balance within the sub-factions of the Codex. The ones that generate more miracle dice I think are now going to be less important, as you're going to get quite a lot of them for free anyway. Maybe have a bit more of an emphasis on ones that give you other buffs, but I think that Ebon Chalice in particular will still be interesting. That still mean that you'll have even more dice to merge together and make more 6 results. The other change of the Sisters is a bit of a side grade for Valorous Heart. As we'll see with Space Marine Salamanders, they basically sort of overlap a bit with Armour of Contempt now. To stop their ability stacking with that or being made useless by it, they've now changed the rule that wound rolls may not be re-rolled against Valorous Heart units. While overall I still think it's a buff because of course they get Armour of Contempt, now everyone gets that as well. So I feel like the relative usefulness of Valorous Heart will go down a fair bit. It does help against some specific things, say units buffed by lieutenants, lightning claws, or Death Guard plague weapons, but I feel like they're going to have less of a niche than they did before. Next up, and perhaps with some of the best buffs in the data slate, we have the Imperial Guard, who saw a fair few small increases last time, but nothing particularly major. I think the tank orders and infantry order changes were kind of helpful, but didn't really increase the army's strength very much. The biggest deal was the Lehman Russes with the 2+ armor saves. That does genuinely add durability to one of the stronger units. Now though, they've gained an army-wide special rule and a big buff to infantry squads. The army-wide rule is Hammer of the Emperor. If every unit with the regiment tag is from the same regiment in your army, then for ranged attacks, 6s to hit will auto wound the enemy. This one's a very solid damage increase indeed, particularly as when you're hitting on 4s, 1 out of every 3 hits is going to be a 6, so that's going to add up to an awful lot of auto wounds. I think this is the sort of thing that Guard needed. They are supposed to be a powerful shooting faction, so just doing something very broad brush to make them a little bit more dangerous I think is a really good idea. The 6's auto wound thing will be particularly good on things like mass las fire with first rank fire, second rank fire. With a bunch of strength 3 shots, you're often not going to be wounding the enemy. If you're guaranteeing that 1 in every 3 shots that you fire is going to auto wound, you are going to be sacking a whole ton of saves on the enemy, no matter what target you're shooting at. It does seem that with enough las guns and faith in the Emperor, you might actually be able to deal with heavy targets. It's pretty much good across the board though. Even higher strength things like las cannons and demolisher cannons will appreciate having a few less wound rolls to convert. It doesn't apply to literally the entire army though, it is just the ones with the regimental tag, so that doesn't include regimental advisors, auxiliary units like Ogren and Bulgrin, and I believe that Militarum Tempestus Scions also wouldn't get this, as they don't actually have the regiment keyword, they have the Tempestus regiment keyword, which is different. It feels like a rule just aimed as a bit of a general power boost, perhaps a get you by type thing, until they eventually get their codex, which looks like it's going to be one of the last of 9th. Secondly, and a really quite weird but quite interesting change, is that infantry squads are going up in points to 60 points, but all war gear on them is now free. It really is a bit of a random change. 9th edition in general you pay points cost for the various upgrades on your unit, so you would expect say an infantry squad with a las cannon and plasma gun to cost a fair bit more than ones with just las guns, as obviously they do have better guns. Now though, that's not going to be the case. If you're running infantry squads, then you may as well deck them out with as much fancy gear as you possibly can. Power swords on the sergeants, likely las cannons as heavy weapons, and probably plasma guns or melter guns on the specials. You are paying 5 points more than you would have been, but for the amount of gear that you can pick up for that 5 point extra, I think that it's going to be well worth the cost. Definitely seems like a buff to infantry squads. I'm still perhaps not convinced that they're going to be strong enough to just be the massive damage dealers of the army in their own right. You'd probably still want to mix infantry squads and tanks, but between this and that Hammer of the Emperor rule, it does look like Foot Guard could be far more tempting as a force that could actually deal its own damage, rather than just be cheap chaff to keep back the enemy from the guns. Looking forward to doing a bit of experimenting with my guard on the table. I'll definitely be trying out a Horde Guard list with this. Overall though, really nice to see a big buff for the Imperial Guard, one of the factions that's struggling the very most in the game right now, and the previous balanced data slate was kind of minimal in terms of what it did for the faction. Next up we get into the first of the nerfs for the big 3 power armies right now. Adeptus Custodes have seen a trio of nerfs, the first one being to objective secured. Previously they could have it on any infantry units within the army, things like characters and elite infantry would qualify. Now, like the majority of factions, it is just limited to the troops. That does seem reasonable enough to give them a little bit less of an edge over objectives, seeing as they are pretty decent at dominating the table with their raw golden might anyway. They still have that rule which allows each custody to count as more models for the purposes of objectives, so they're still going to be a bit of a chore to take down. Otherwise, it's some nerfs to 4 different stratagems. 3 of them have become only 1 use. Those 3 are Esteemed Amalgam, the one where the Emperor's Chosen shield company can borrow a different shield host's trait. Certainly doesn't hurt to make the Emperor's Chosen a little bit less auto-include. Then there's the Emperor's Auspex, that's the one that turns off enemy rerolls, a crazily powerful defensive stratagem. Limiting that to just once will be a decent durability nerf to the army as a whole. Not only that, but the stratagem now only applies to Custodes infantry, so you can't use it on the bikes. Finally, Martial Discretion is also one use only. That's the one where you got to choose one martial guitar and change it for another, basically stopping you just spamming a powerful guitar each turn if it is going to help out against the given matchup. Finally, Arcane Genetic Alchemy is the Custodes transhuman stratagem, the one where you can only wound them on a 4+. You can still use that multiple times now, but it can no longer apply to the bikes, it is infantry only. Between that and the Auspex stratagem, the bikes are going to be a lot easier to shift now. You're not going to be only able to be wounded on 4s and then turn off all rerolls as well. Overall, it's definitely a nerf to the Custodes command point tricks, and they will be scoring a few less objectives as they go due to Obsec in the situations where that matters. But I feel like the Custodes really haven't come out of this too badly, considering how much they were dominating tournaments after their book dropped. You've still got 85-point versus Praetors with the salvo launchers. Trajan Valorous is still a mere 160 points auto-include, and while they'll be getting a bit less value out of their command points, they are still going to be spent somewhere. They do have plenty of other decent stratagems within the book to use. I feel like despite these changes, Custodes are going to remain pretty darn strong. For Death Guard, obviously the main change for them is Armour of Contempt. It looks like their durability might really be a thing to fear once more. Layering essentially +1 saves against most attacks that aren't AP 0 is really nice, particularly when you're combining that with -1 damage, toughness 5 and decent saves. As well as that though, the Blight Lord and the Death Shroud Terminators get objective secured as well, kind of in a mirror to the Thousand Suns Terminators which had this already. Kind of gives them another reason to have the Terminators at the centre of the force, and some of the most important units that you can include in the army. I kind of wonder if the points increases in Chapter Approved might have been in some way to reflect that this was coming. Both squads of Terminators went up, it did feel maybe slightly needlessly. I kind of wonder if they were anticipating the +1 save and objective secured coming in. Next up, and not surprisingly attracting the heaviest nerfs out of any of the factions, are the Harlequins. They'd basically been seeming like they were a level above Tau and Custodes, quite comfortably looking like one of the strongest factions in 9th edition. These were the one unit where Games Workshop actually felt the need to adjust points for. Void Weavers going up an insane 40 points to 130, and Star Weavers going up 15 to 95. Definitely looks like a good reason not to rush out and buy the latest flavour of the month before an FAQ. I feel everyone who went out to collect 9 Void Weavers might well not be fielding them in quite so many games anymore. They were kind of ridiculously undercosted at 90. Even so though, going all the way up to 130 really is quite a massive bump. I feel they might have got to the point where they might actually be overcosted again now. I think I might have put them a bit more at the 115 to 120 mark myself. In any case, I feel like most lists are probably not going to want to spam 9 of them anymore. Perhaps good news for the Harlequin Skyweaver bikes. I think they're going to be a lot more of an interesting choice in comparison. I think the Starweaver transport increase was kind of expected as well. 95 points I think is still usable for them. They do facilitate a lot of tricks and manoeuvrability with those troops. Pushing them up by 15 does seem like a reasonably heavy nerf to the faction, while certainly not making them so bad that they're unusable. I wonder if we might see a bit more of a balance between mass skimmer Harlequins and a few more troops on foot now. It certainly seems a bit more of a choice than it was. Otherwise for the Harlequins, the only other changes were some nerfs to 2 key characters. Mirror Architect is the Shadowseer pivotal role that makes all the units within 6 inches counter 6 inches further away, utterly ruining short-range weapons. Now Mirror Architects can only be used to protect one unit in that way. You have to nominate it in the command phase, rather than it just being an always-on aura. Definitely makes it a lot less useful. I guess still could be pretty annoying if you put it on, say, a unit of 3 Void Weavers. Could still be some decent range protection. Finally, the Warlord trait Favour of Segarak has been errated to no longer allow it to work on ranged attacks. The reason they've done that is to break the combo with the Death Jester's pivotal role. It could make a single shot automatically hit on a 6, and then you generate 3 extra hits because of that 6, making the Harlequin Death Jester pretty much the undisputed best sniper in the game, and just ridiculously good firepower against anything. I still think Death Jesters are absolutely fine, but that one insane auto-include combo is now gone. Overall, it is a fairly hefty nerf for the Harlequins, particularly to those Void Weavers going up 40 each. I still think that they're looking strong enough, but maybe just toned down a bit from the godly heights that they were before. The basic troops are still really efficient, the Say Death of Light is still amazing, and their support characters are still strong, even if they have lost a couple of their nastiest tricks. Finally, for the major nerfs, we get onto the Tau Empire. As we've mentioned, the barrage changes really affect them. Their low AP airbursts and smart missiles really won't like the AP change, and I think in general they're going to want to focus a lot more on direct line of sight firepower than they were. Otherwise, we've got 4 other nerfs to them, some of them more important than others. Maybe one of the biggest is to Montcar, which used to get you improved AP and reroll 1s to wound against your closest targets. Now if you're within range, it is only reroll 1s to wound, you no longer get a boost to your AP as well. That's going to be a nerf that affects really quite a lot of Tau armies. Most of them did tend to use Montcar as much for the crazy mobility as any damage. It does hit things like the Tau Flamers, air bursts, and pulsed or burst weapons more, the things that cared more about a bit of extra AP. Next up, Farsight Enclaves have been toned down. Their Seps Tenets now only grants their Markalite within 9 inches. Previously, if you dropped within 12 inches, you'd always be +1 to hit against the enemy. Now, at least coming out of Deep Strike, you're not going to be able to get the +1 to hit. That's a fairly significant nerf for them, and just the range in general is going to mean that you're going to be able to activate it less regularly. It might encourage a few more people to play Tau Sept over Farsight, which is still very, very strong. Next up, broadside battlesuits have lost the core keyword, in a change that's very reminiscent of things like Skitarii Ironstriders or Drukhari Talos. Just in general, if you have a big multi-model unit with loads of firepower and decent defense, then the buffs from core are almost always going to be best on them. I think a lot of people, as soon as they saw the Tau Codex, were thinking that broadsides might well lose core, and indeed they have. I feel they're still likely strong enough to get by on raw firepower alone, but they are going to be losing access to a whole bunch of stratagems and options now. Say for example, no more ethereal 5+ feel no pain, or no more +1 to wound in Tau Sept. Their smart missiles will be toned down a bit as well. I kind of wonder whether people might run a few more plasma rifles as a result. Finally, in a small but meaningful change, repulsor impact fields and photon grenades no longer stack their modifier to charge with any other modifiers that are going for the enemy. I'm not sure if there's any other modifiers to charge within the Tau Codex, but I guess it stops them from being used in synergy if you charge 2 units. And I believe it wouldn't stack with difficult terrain as well now, so just parking some battlesuits in a wood wouldn't make them nigh unchargeable. Still very good stratagems though. It's very painful to hand that out to an enemy unit trying to make a long charge. Overall, there's no denying that Tau have been quite drastically toned down here. I think the biggest and most important change was the barrage one, which has been addressed fairly brutally. Montcar's also going to be a general weakening to the faction, and the Farsight Enclaves and broadsides changes are going to hurt if you are using those options. I still think that several things haven't been touched particularly hard though. Tau Sept armies spamming a whole bunch of direct fire crisis suits aren't exactly going to feel very many changes from this, and I'm sure that Tau Empire will still be remaining as a very strong army. Finally, just to round up the other minor changes, out of these the only actual new change is that Space Marine Salamander's trait now prevents wound rerolls, similar to the Valorous Heart. They don't ignore AP-1 anymore, just because with the new Armour of Contempt, all Space Marines effectively ignore AP-1. The wound rerolls thing is kind of situational, lightning claws, plague weapons, lieutenant buffs, but to be honest the AP-1 ignoring thing was also kind of situational as well, so I think it's kind of a side grade for them. Otherwise, they made a bit of an effort to consolidate any balance changes that they'd made in FAQs and put them in this Dataslate as opposed to just in the FAQs. I feel that's quite a reasonable change, as it sort of differentiates the changes that were made for power purposes as opposed to just the clarifications. For the AdMech, we've just got listed all of their changes to their rules, things like the removal of core from Ironstriders and the stratagem nerfs for their Skitarii Vanguard and Rangers. We've got the Drukhari changes, such as Talos losing core, Covens getting the -1 damage nerf, and Dark Technomancers not being stacked with liquefiers, and then the changes from the other balanced data slates, things like the Necron units that gained core, the Chaos Marines Death to the False Emperor buff, and the Orc limitation on boggy spam. Chaos Marines, of course, haven't come out of this too badly, what with the +1 to save on their units. I'm going to guess that that will be a rule that will be in the new Chaos Codex, as well as in the new Space Marine one later in the year. So overall, I think this balanced data slate has largely done a very good job. Nerfs to the top armies, a few buffs to some of the ones that were struggling more. Obviously not everything's perfect, but broadly it's a big step in the right direction. Maybe things that I was wondering whether or not they might have changes to were perhaps craft worlds or tyrannids. The craft worlds certainly haven't been tearing things up anywhere near as hard as the Harlequins, though still they do look very strong. I guess we did see Baharos toned down slightly in the Eldar FAQ the other day. It'll be kind of interesting to see if they rise to more prominence now a lot of the other competitors have been toned down. Perhaps more interestingly, and maybe problematically, there's no new changes for the Tyranids. I guess that kind of makes sense, technically their codex isn't really even out yet, but a lot of their new combos are looking kind of monstrously strong. The amount of mortal wounds they can dump out with Maleceptors and Neurothropes, the insanely undercosted Harpy, and perhaps most relevantly, massively buffed monster datasheets that still work just fine with Crusher Stampedes. I feel like Crusher Stampede was a nice update that made the Tyranid monsters useful and powerful even when they had bad datasheets. Now for the most part they've got pretty decent datasheets, getting -1 damage, free invuls, and a bunch of other things. Might well just make them a bit excessive. I guess it could be the sort of thing that they might choose to address in the Tyranid Codex FAQ rather than here though. I really hope that after these changes we aren't just going to go back to having the latest codex being the most powerful. Hopefully the other factions can hold their own against the bugs. Otherwise there's nothing for Knights. We know their codexes are coming soon, either this month or next. And kind of sadly nothing for Chaos Demons. I kind of feel they've been overlooked in the balanced data slate so far. Sure, spamming Be'lakor and loads of Keepers of Secrets is kind of okay, but the vast majority of their codex I think could use a bit of a tune-up. Again, hopefully their codex wouldn't be all that far away. So an absolutely huge amount to unpack here. Let me know if you think that there's anything important that I've missed down in the comments below. I think broadly though they've done a pretty decent job of making competitive 40k a bit more interesting again. It really was in a bad place. Some solid nerfs to the biggest offenders from the top armies, and some solid buffs to most of the rest of the field. Definitely a few things I would have done differently, but I'm sure that whatever they'd come out, most people will be saying the same anyway. Let me know what you think down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k content coming, with new videos out just about every day. I feel like we'll have to talk about the Armour of Contempt and the guard changes in their own videos, so stay tuned if you'd like to see that. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Making all these videos does take a fair amount of time and effort. If you are enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated, and channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some really big model kits every month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.